The sun was sinking behind the dense pine trees of Havenbrook, casting long shadows over the golden fields that stretched to the horizon. It was the kind of small southern town where everyone knew everyone else, and where secrets, once whispered, traveled faster than wildfire. Lena Carter stood barefoot on the wooden porch of the weathered house she had called home her entire life. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of rain on dry earth lingering from an earlier storm. Her sundress clung to her skin, but she didn't notice. Her eyes were fixed on the dirt road leading away from the property, though nothing moved but the occasional dust devil twisting in the distance. Inside the house, a harsh coughing fit rattled the silence. She turned, her heart tightening as she rushed back inside. Her mother, Helen Carter, lay curled in the threadbare armchair near the fireplace. Her skin was pale, almost translucent under the dim yellow light. Each cough sounded like it might tear something inside her. "Water, Mama?" Lena asked softly, already reaching for the glass. Helen shook her head, her eyes tired. "I'm fine, baby." Lena crouched beside her, brushing a damp strand of hair from her mother's forehead. "You're not fine." Helen didn't answer. They both knew the truth. Stage 4 lung cancer. Diagnosed too late.
No insurance.
No savings. No options. Lena had done everything she could, working double shifts at the diner, cleaning houses, even sewing dresses for the church ladies in town. But the bills piled higher than she could climb, and the hospital had made it clear, no money, no treatment. In the next room, a soft clatter signaled movement. Billy, her 12-year-old brother, was doing his best to finish his homework on the cracked kitchen table. He looked up at her with wide, unsure eyes, and Lena forced a smile. Everything in her life felt like it was cracking. One wrong move, and it would all come crumbling down. That night, as she lay awake on the lumpy mattress she shared with Billy, Lena stared at the ceiling fan spinning slowly overhead. The silence pressed on her chest like a weight. She thought about her father, who had died in a construction accident 5 years ago. About the man who had once promised to marry her and take her away from Havenbrook, until he found someone with a family name and a trust fund. There were no fairy tales for girls like her. The next morning, just after sunrise, Lena was hauling 2 buckets of water from the old pump down the hill. The grass was slick with dew, and her dress clung to her ankles as she walked barefoot, balanced, focused. She was halfway up the hill when the sound of an engine echoed through the quiet. She looked up. A sleek black Cadillac was idling in front of her house, its polished body glaring under the morning light. The sight was so out of place that for a moment, Lena thought she was dreaming. The driver's door opened. A tall man in a black suit stepped out. His hair was perfectly combed back, silver as frost. His cane tapped lightly against the gravel as he approached. Richard Blackwell.
Everjone in Havenbrook Knesename.
A wealthy businessman who owned most of the farmland around the county. A war veteran. A philanthropist. And depending on who you asked, either a lonely old man or a charming widower with secrets buried deep. Lena watched him walk toward the house. Her hands tightened around the handles of the water buckets. "Miss Carter," he greeted her with a voice deep and clear. "I hope you'll forgive the unannounced visit." She said nothing, only nodded warily. "I've heard of your family's situation," he continued, glancing toward the house. "And I'd like to make you an offer." Lena frowned. "An offer?" He smiled. It was a practiced smile, warm but empty. "I would like you to marry me." The bucket slipped from her hands, water splashing at her feet. For a long moment, the world went silent. "I'm sorry, what?" she asked, blinking. "You heard me," he said evenly. "I'm looking for companionship."
I don't believe in wasting time.
"In return, I'll ensure your mother receives the best medical care money can buy. Your brother can finish school, attend college if he chooses. Your debts will disappear." Lena stared at him, her heart pounding. Was this some kind of twisted joke? "Why me?" she asked. "Because you're strong," he said simply. "And because I believe you understand sacrifice." Helen came to the porch, leaning on the frame for support. "Mr. Blackwell." She began, but Richard raised a hand gently. "I mean no disrespect, ma'am. This is simply a proposition."
No pressure.
"But time, I believe, is not on your side." He turned back to Lena. "I'll give you until tonight to decide." And just like that, he returned to the car, leaving behind nothing but tire tracks and a silence more deafening than before. That evening, Lena sat beside her mother, who clutched her daughter's hand like it was her last anchor.
I know what you're thinking, Helen said softly.
That this is insane. That you'll be giving up your whole life. Lena didn't speak. But baby, what life do you have here?
Herr Mother's voice cracked.
You've been dying a little each day since your father passed.
And now I'm just dragging you down with me.
Tears welled in Lena's eyes.
Maybe this is who you save us. Maybe it's who you save yourself.
That night, Lena walked out onto the porch, the crickets chirping a lullaby in the distance.
The stars up over Havenbrook glittered like cold diamonds.
She looked up and whispered, "Daddy, if you can hear me, I hope you understand." And with a deep breath that tasted of dust and sorrow, she made her choice. She would marry Richard Blackwell. To save her family. Even if it meant losing herself. The sun rose heavy and golden the next day, casting long beams of light through the lace curtains of the Carter home. But no light seemed to reach Lena's heart. She sat at the edge of her bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the floorboards worn smooth from years of pacing feet. In the next room, her mother's breath rattled like dry leaves, and Billy hummed quietly as he packed his worn-out backpack for school. The normalcy of the morning contrasted cruelly with what was about to happen. At precisely 10 a.m., the black Cadillac returned. Richard Blackwell stepped out, dressed sharply in another tailored suit, dark gray this time, with a matching silk tie. The man looked more like he was attending a business merger than a wedding. In his hand, he held a slim leather folder. "Are you ready, Miss Carter?" he asked. Lena hesitated at the doorway, her fingers brushing the frame. Her mother sat behind her in a wheelchair, cheeks pale but eyes shining with pride and guilt. Billy clutched her hand like he was afraid she'd disappear the moment he let go. Lena gave them both a trembling smile, then stepped forward. Richard offered his arm. She took it. The courthouse ceremony was quick and impersonal. A judge read from a script. Papers were signed. No vows. No rings.
No kiss.
Just signatures, handshakes, and a chilling formality. Lena had worn a pale blue dress her mother sewed for her high school graduation. It hung differently on her now, tighter at the chest, looser at the waist, as if it no longer belonged to her. There were no photos, no guests. Just the two of them and the notary. By noon, Lena Carter had become Mrs. Blackwell. She sat beside Richard in the back of the Cadillac, her hands folded tightly on her lap. The ride to the mansion was long and silent, winding through back roads and dense woods. The further they drove, the more the trees seemed to crowd the road, their shadows stretching like fingers across the windshield. Finally, the car emerged onto a clearing, and the mansion came into view. Blackwell Estate. The house stood like a relic of another time, 3 stories of gray stone and iron railings, ivy crawling up the sides like veins. 2 towers flanked the central structure, and dark windows stared out like empty eyes. A fountain stood in the center of the roundabout, dry and cracked, its angel statue weathered by years of wind and rain. Lena stared at it, something in her chest tightening. "You'll get used to it," Richard said, noticing her expression. "Will I?" She wondered silently. Inside, the house was immaculate, if not welcoming. Marble floors gleamed under her feet. The walls were lined with portraits, stern-faced men and elegant women, all of them expressionless. The ceilings were high, the furniture dark and old-fashioned. Every room smelled faintly of cedar and dust, as though the house had been sealed for a century. Martha greeted them at the door. She was in her 60s, with gray hair pulled into a tight bun and deep lines etched into her face. She wore a crisp uniform and an unreadable expression. "This is Martha," Richard introduced. "She's been with the estate for over 30 years. She'll help you get settled."
Martha gave Lena Lichtnot.
"Your room is prepared upstairs, Mrs. Blackwell." Her room. Lena turned to Richard. "Yes," he replied simply. "We'll keep separate quarters. It's more convenient that way." Something in his tone told her not to question it. Martha led her up the winding staircase, past heavy velvet curtains and antique mirrors. At the end of the west wing, she opened a door to a large bedroom. The furniture was ornate, the windows covered with thick drapes that blocked the sunlight. The air smelled faintly of lavender, and something else, something older, like paper and time. You may unpack your belongings here, Martha said. Dinner is at 6.
Mr. Blackwell ist punktual.
Lena nodded. Thank you. The door closed behind her, leaving her alone. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. The room was beautiful, but it didn't feel like hers. It didn't feel like anyone's. It was a display, not a home. She thought of her mother, of Billy, of their cramped little house. She imagined them now, eating soup from chipped bowls, the air heavy with silence and hope. She reminded herself, this is for them. She stayed in her room until dinner, too overwhelmed to explore. At 6 o'clock sharp, she descended the staircase and found Richard already seated at the long dining table, a glass of wine in hand. The table could seat 20, but only 2 plates were set. She sat across from him, her back straight, her hands neatly folded. Dinner was served by Martha, roasted chicken, steamed vegetables, garlic mashed potatoes. It was delicious, but Lena barely tasted it. Richard ate in silence, occasionally glancing at her. You'll find the estate has its rules, he said finally. Some rooms are private. I expect those boundaries to be respected. Of course, she murmured. There's no need to involve yourself in household matters. Martha handles the staff. I require little. And, what do you expect of me? Lena asked carefully. He sipped his wine. Presence, he said. Respect. Discretion. She nodded, unsure what any of that truly meant. After dinner, he rose and disappeared into his study. Lena remained at the table, her fork resting on a plate of untouched food. She felt like a guest in a stranger's home. A well-fed prisoner. That night, she lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The mansion creaked with age.
The wind whisperet through cracks in the windows.
Somewhere down the hall, she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their feet. She sat up, heart pounding. But when she opened the door, the hallway was empty. She closed it again and locked it.
Outside. The woods swayed under the moonlight. The house stood silent, watching.
And Lena Carter, now Lena Blackwell, pulled the blanket tighter around her, already wondering what she had walked into. 3 days had passed since the wedding, but it might as well have been 3 years. Time moved differently inside the Blackwell estate, slow and soundless, like dust settling on forgotten furniture. The house didn't feel alive. It didn't breathe. And neither, Lena thought, did she. She spent her days walking aimlessly through the west wing, memorizing the curve of the hallway, the way the floor creaked near the second window, the dull smell of the drapes. No one else roamed those halls. Not Martha, not any other staff, if there were any. She had yet to see anyone else working in the mansion. When she tried to venture further, she found locked doors. Every corridor branching from the main hallway had rooms that were sealed, their handles cold and unyielding. Some bore plaques, library, drawing room, guest suites. Others had no names, just doors that seemed to watch her as she walked by. She asked Martha once gently about the rooms. Mr. Blackwell prefers privacy, Martha said without meeting her eyes. Best not to pry. Lena didn't push further, but her unease grew. At night, the mansion transformed. Shadows deepened. The soft tick of the grandfather clock in the foyer echoed like footsteps. Sometimes, Lena thought she heard whispers, just out of reach, soft and fluttering like moth wings. Once, she could have sworn she saw a flicker of movement in one of the mirrors in the hallway. But when she turned, nothing was there. It wasn't fear exactly, not yet. It was disquiet. Like the house was keeping secrets. Like it remembered things it wasn't supposed to forget. One evening, a week after the ceremony, Richard invited her to dinner again. The table was as extravagant as always, crystal glasses, polished silverware, Martha's impeccable cuisine, but the conversation was minimal. "How are you settling in?" he asked, slicing into his roast with mechanical precision. "It's quiet," Lena replied carefully. "You'll find that's a blessing," he said. "Most people don't appreciate silence until it's gone." She looked at him across the table, trying to read something in his expression, warmth, interest, anything human, but his face was a mask.
Not cruel, not kind. Just unreadable.
"I was wondering," she began, hesitant. "Why me?" He set his fork down, folded his hands. I suppose you could call it timing, he said. I needed someone, and you were there. That's not really an answer. He tilted his head, studying her. You have qualities that are rare. Resilience. Loyalty. A willingness to sacrifice. She felt her skin prickle. You make it sound like I was recruited for a job, not married. Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes.
You don't believe in romance, Mrs. Blackwell.
I believe in structure. Mutual benefit. You saved your family. I gained peace in my home. That is the arrangement. She looked down at her plate, her appetite gone. Later that night, as she walked back to her room, she passed a portrait she hadn't noticed before. It hung at the end of the west wing, a large oil painting of a woman in a crimson gown, standing in the rose garden behind the mansion. The woman looked familiar. Lena stepped closer. The eyes. The jawline. The defiant curve of her mouth. She remembered the photograph she had seen on Richard's desk that day in the courthouse, quickly tucked away when she entered. It had been a woman, younger than Richard, beautiful in a way that didn't try. This was her.
No plaqué.
No name. Lena reached out to touch the frame, but a voice stopped her. You shouldn't be out here this late. She turned. Martha stood in the hallway, her hands folded in front of her apron. I couldn't sleep, Lena said. Who is she? Martha glanced at the portrait, then back at Lena. No one. A former guest.
August.
Martha's mouth tightened. It's not my place to say. Did she live here? She's gone now. The answer hung in the air like smoke. Martha stepped closer, lowering her voice. Mrs. Blackwell, I don't mean to scare you. But this house is particular. Best to keep to your quarters after dark. And don't go exploring. Curiosity isn't always rewarded here. Then she turned and walked away, her shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. Lena stood there for a long time, staring at the painting, wondering how many other guests had once walked these halls. Wondering how many had left, and how many hadn't. The next morning, Lena woke to find a note slipped under her door. Meet me in the conservatory. 11 a.m. There was no signature. Her heart thudded as she checked the hallway. Empty. Quiet. She'd passed the conservatory once, one of the few unlocked rooms. It was at the far end of the ground floor, behind a pair of glass-paned doors. She slipped downstairs, past the dining room, and eased the door open. The conservatory was bathed in soft light. Plants hung from the ceiling, vines curled around the windows, and a faint smell of earth filled the air. It was the first room that felt alive. Ethan Moore stood near the far window, his hands in his pockets. Lena froze. She didn't know his name then. Only that he was a stranger. Young, unshaven, dressed like he didn't belong in this house. Who are you? She whispered. I could ask you the same, he said, turning to face her. But I already know. You're the new Mrs. Blackwell. I don't understand. How did you get in? I'm not here to hurt you, he said quickly. I'm a journalist.
Investigative.
I've been looking into Richard Blackwell for 2 years. Lena's blood ran cold. Why? Because women disappear around him. The conservatory fell silent. Lena stared at the man standing in front of her, Ethan Moore, as she would learn later, but at that moment, he was simply a stranger in her husband's home, speaking words that didn't make sense and yet felt disturbingly real. Women disappear around him, he had said. She looked at the door, her mind racing. You need to go, she whispered. I'm not here to cause trouble, Ethan said quickly. I don't want to drag you into anything dangerous. But I've been following Richard Blackwell for 2 years. His former wives, fiancés, companions, most of them vanish. No police reports.
No funerals.
Nothing. Just silence. You're wrong, Lena said, though her voice lacked conviction. Ethan studied her. Has he told you about them? Any of them? She shook her head. He said he wanted companionship. Companionship doesn't come with locked doors and secrets. Lena clenched her fists. You need to leave before someone sees you. Please. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. I'll go. But if you ever feel like something's wrong, really wrong, find a way to contact me. My name is Ethan Moore.
Ivritte for the Southern Dispatch.
I'm not the only one watching him. And just like that, he disappeared through a side door, leaving Lena alone with a heart pounding hard enough to bruise bone. She stood there for several minutes, listening for footsteps, waiting for the walls to betray her presence, but the house remained still. Later that evening, she sat through another silent dinner with Richard. His expression was as unreadable as ever, his questions calculated and hollow. "How was your day?" he asked, sipping his wine. "Quiet," she replied. He smiled faintly. "I find that quietude breeds clarity." When she returned to her room, Lena found herself staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing down on her like a blanket soaked in dread. The next few days passed in a fog. The mansion remained mostly empty.
No guests.
No visitors. No phone calls. Sometimes she saw Martha, moving like a shadow through the hallways, always busy, always quiet. Other times, Lena thought she saw flickers of movement in the corners of her vision, but when she turned, there was nothing. Mirrors seemed to reflect more than just light. Portraits seemed to follow her with their eyes. And always, the air in the house felt just a few degrees too cold. She began to suspect that the house wasn't merely silent, it was listening. Once, she tried to ask Martha more directly. "Do you ever feel like this place doesn't want anyone here?" Martha paused as she folded a towel.
"The house belongs to Mr. Blackwell," she said softly.
"It does what he allows." Lena frowned. "That's not what I asked." Martha hesitated, then lowered her voice. "You shouldn't ask questions, dear. Not here. Some things are better left behind locked doors." Locked doors. There were so many of them. Lena became obsessed with them. Every hallway in the east and north wings had doors that wouldn't budge. Some were old, their paint chipped and brass handles worn. Others looked new, reinforced, as if someone expected someone, or something, to break out. One evening, she tried a doorknob that clicked ever so slightly, as if it hadn't been locked properly. Her heart leapt. Before she could turn it, a voice spoke behind her. "You're not allowed in there." She turned quickly. Richard stood at the end of the hallway, his face cast in half-shadow. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I was just—" "You were just about to break a rule," he interrupted. "I told you when you arrived, some rooms are private. That hasn't changed." His voice was calm, but there was a coldness to it now, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "I understand," she said, retreating from the door. He didn't move. "Do you?" Lena met his gaze, something tightening in her chest. "Yes." Only then did he step aside and let her pass. She hurried back to her room, locking the door behind her.
That night, the dreams came. She saw a woman in red standing at the base of the stairs.
Her face was blurred, indistinct, but her eyes burned into Lena's memory. In the dream, the woman whispered something Lena couldn't hear. Then she turned and walked down a hallway that didn't exist in the house, long and endless and filled with doors.
Lena woke in a cold sweat.
She sat at her desk, the first light of dawn creeping in through the drapes. Her fingers itched to write something down, anything, but she didn't know where to begin. What was she experiencing?
Ghosts?
Memories? Guilt? She reached for the notebook she'd started keeping, just a few pages of thoughts, observations, moments that didn't sit right. She opened to a blank page and wrote one word. Missing. She circled it twice. She had no proof.
No hard evidence.
But the pieces were forming.
The woman in the painting.
The locked rooms.
Marthas 4. Etans Warning. End Richard himself. Kind, Polite, end utterly impenetrable.
Later that day, Lena wandered the ground floor again, noting that certain rooms, ones that had been locked days before, now stood open. The study.
The music room.
Even a sitting room that had been sealed with a deadbolt. It was almost as if Richard wanted her to explore. To feel safe. To let her guard down. But she didn't. Instead, she waited until late that night, when the house was silent, and Richard had retreated to his study. She slipped out of bed, tiptoed barefoot down the hallway, and returned to the door she'd nearly opened before. This time, the lock was gone. She turned the handle. It opened. The room beyond was dark, the air thick with age. She clicked on her flashlight and stepped inside. Shelves lined the walls, hundreds of books, photo albums and files. A large mahogany desk sat in the center, covered in dust. She stepped closer, brushing a finger across the surface. Then she saw it.
A wedding photo.
Not hers. The same woman from the painting, in a white dress, standing beside Richard. Her face was radiant.
A lieve.
Lena picked up the frame, turning it over. A date was etched into the bottom. July 14, 2007. 18 years ago. Her heart pounded. The woman had been real. And she'd lived here. But she wasn't in any obituary. Not in any town record. And certainly not in Richard's stories. Lena placed the photo back carefully and turned toward the desk drawers. If there were secrets in this house, this was where they lived. And she was ready to find them. Lena closed the door behind her with a soft click, sealing herself inside the forbidden room. The silence was suffocating. Her flashlight beam darted across the old study, brushing over shelves filled with books bound in cracked leather, file boxes, and dozens of objects that looked untouched for years. She approached the desk, her breath shallow. The wedding photo still sat at the center. The woman in it, young, glowing, hopeful, looked nothing like the cold stone silence of the mansion. She felt the ghost of a smile pressing against her lips, a smile not her own. She opened the first drawer. Inside were papers, property deeds, marriage certificates, documents of transfer. Everything carefully labeled, filed by year. She pulled one folder free.
Camille Harper Blackwell. Married, July 14, 2007. Presumed missing, November 2029, 2007.
4 months. No death certificate.
No divorce papers.
Lena's heart kicked in her chest. She flipped through the rest of the file, copies of her driver's license, a prenuptial agreement, hospital records showing minor injuries, notes from what appeared to be therapy sessions. The last document was a letter, handwritten and never sent. I'm scared, but I don't know if it's me or him. He watches me. I can't prove anything, but something is wrong in this house. If anyone finds this, please don't let me disappear too. Lena sat back in the chair, cold washing over her spine like water. She wasn't imagining it. She wasn't being paranoid. Something had happened to Camille Harper. And from the looks of the shelves around her, Camille wasn't the only one. She rose and moved to the cabinet on the left wall. Its glass doors were locked, but a small iron key rested on the top of the desk. She used it to open the cabinet and froze. Inside were 6 white boxes, each labeled with a woman's name and a date.
Elise Monroe, 1998. Sophia Clark, 2002. Camille Harper, 2007. Anna Davis, 2012. Jessica Reed, 2017. Chloe Bennett, 2021.
She counted them. 6 women. All within 5-year intervals. Each box contained a similar set of items, copies of ID, photos, brief notes in Richard's hand. Some had dried flowers. One had a broken bracelet.
Another, a lipstick case. Souvenirs.
Trophies. Lena's stomach twisted. These weren't just relationships that ended. These were women who vanished.
Forgotten.
Absorbed into the silence of this house. She turned to the desk again and opened the bottom drawer. A leather-bound journal sat on top of a stack of documents. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Richard's handwriting was small, neat, methodical. Elise was too emotional. I tried to be patient, but the tears were constant. I needed peace. I had no choice.
Sophia refused the prenup.
It was foolish of her to think I would allow that. She left, of course, but not in the way she expected. Camille was the closest. For a moment, I thought it could work. But then she began to suspect. That couldn't be allowed. Each entry detailed complaints, rationalizations, cold analysis of each woman's flaws, and then the inevitable solution, removal. There was nothing graphic.
Nothing explicit.
But the implications were clear. These women didn't walk away. They were erased. By him. By the man she had married. Lena closed the journal, her breathing ragged. Her hands were ice. Her body wanted to move, to run, to scream, but she forced herself to stay calm. She slipped the journal and Camille's file into a canvas satchel hanging on the coat rack in the corner. It looked old, dusty. No one would notice if it went missing. She quietly returned everything else to its place, closed the drawers, locked the cabinet, and carefully shut the door behind her. Back in her room, she collapsed onto the bed, clutching the satchel to her chest. She stared at the ceiling, listening.
The house made no sound.
But she could feel it now, deeper than ever, the mansion breathing around her, watching, waiting. The silence was no longer emptiness. It was the absence of truth. The air itself held secrets. She didn't sleep that night. By dawn, she had made a decision. She would survive. But survival meant strategy.
She couldn't confront Richard.
Not yet. Not without evidence. Not without help. Ethan. She needed to find Ethan again. But how? She hadn't seen him since that day in the conservatory. If he was watching the house, maybe he was still close. Maybe there was a way to reach him. She went to her closet, retrieved an old sketch pad, and tore out a clean page. She wrote in quick, careful script. I have proof.
You wäre right.
I need to meet. Safe place. Tomorrow. 9 p.m.
Garden behind chapel. Born after reading.
She folded the note, wrapped it in plastic to protect it from the rain, and waited for her chance. That evening, just before dinner, she spotted Martha placing the tableware in the dining room. Lena approached her, calm, composed. Martha, would you mind delivering something to the chapel for me? Just a drawing I did. I left it behind the altar when I was there last week. Martha looked at her, suspicion flickering in her eyes. Why not ask me sooner? I only just remembered, Lena said smoothly. Please.
I know it's a strange request.
After a pause, Martha nodded. All right. I'll be back before dinner. As soon as she left, Lena crept into the foyer, slipped the note under the lining of the box Martha always carried her books in, then returned to her room. She had no way of knowing if it would reach Ethan. She had no guarantee he'd show. But it was the only card she had left to play. Dinner that night was colder than usual. Richard made small talk about local politics, land development, a charity gala next month. He smiled more than he usually did. Polished. Charming. Calculated. It terrified her. When she returned to her room, she placed the journal and the file inside a locked drawer under the floorboard, a secret compartment she'd found during one of her restless nights. She would sleep, if only to keep up the illusion.
Because tomorrow, awaiting mich change.
Tomorrow, she would meet Ethan. And together, they would decide what to do with the truth. But as she lay in bed, a question echoed in her mind. How many more boxes are waiting to be filled? Rain began to fall just after sunset, soft at first, then heavier, beating against the windows like impatient fingers. Lena stood in front of her mirror, brushing her hair with mechanical strokes. She had gone through every possible scenario in her mind, what she would say to Ethan, how much she could reveal, what she would do if he didn't show up. The satchel lay by the door, the journal and Camille's file tucked safely inside. At dinner, Richard was in unusually high spirits. He poured her wine without being asked and spoke about a foundation he was launching to support disadvantaged youth, as he called it. His charm was almost convincing. Almost. But Lena saw the flicker in his eye when he talked about public appearances, the way his fingers tapped rhythmically on the table, a beat only he could hear. Would you like to come to the gala next week? He asked. She blinked. Excuse me.
The Charity Gala.
I think it would be good for us to be seen. A proper couple.
Public support matters.
She hesitated. Of course. I'd be honored.
Excellent.
He smiled, then returned to his meal. Every minute at that table was a performance. And tonight, the curtain had to fall. At precisely 8:50 p.m., Lena stepped out of her room, the satchel slung over her shoulder. She walked calmly, barefoot to avoid echoing footsteps, and exited through the side door Martha usually used to hang laundry. The garden path behind the estate was slick with mud, but she moved quickly, heart thudding in her chest.
The chapel sat on the edge of the woods, old and half forgotten.
Once used for weddings and funerals, it now stood empty, just another piece of the Blackwell legacy gathering dust. The stained glass windows glowed faintly in the moonlight. Vines crawled up the stone walls, and moss had begun to take over the roof. Lena pushed open the heavy wooden door. The air inside was cool and still. She moved toward the back, past the altar, and into the small garden behind the building. The hedges were overgrown, the stone bench cracked and leaning. She waited, watching the trees sway in the wind. Then, footsteps. She turned sharply. Ethan emerged from the shadows, hood pulled low, eyes scanning the surroundings before they landed on her. "You got the note," she whispered. He nodded. "Barely. I wasn't sure it was from you. I've been circling the property every night for the past week." "I found something," she said quickly.
I found a waiting.
She handed him the satchel. He opened it, shining a small flashlight over the journal and Camille's file. As he flipped through the pages, his expression changed from focus to something colder, anger. "My God," he muttered. "This is more than I ever expected." "There's more," Lena said. 5 other women. I found boxes. Files.
Personal belongings.
He keeps them like trophies." Ethan looked at her, the flashlight beam casting sharp shadows on his face. "Do you have access to those boxes?" "I didn't take them. I didn't want him to notice. But I know where they are."
I can show you.
"This is enough to open a real investigation," he said. "But we'll need more." He's careful. "If we go to the police now, he'll shut it all down, make us look unstable." Lena nodded. "I figured. I have a contact in Atlanta, an FBI field agent. She's worked on high-profile abuse cases. If we present this to her directly, bypass the local PD, we might get real protection." "When can you meet her?" "Tomorrow."
Eli to nicht. Drive trugs a night if you have to.
Lena felt a small weight lift from her chest. This was real. This wasn't just fear and ghosts and locked doors. There was a way out. Ethan looked at her carefully. "How safe are you right now?" She paused. I think he's watching me more closely than before. But he doesn't know I found the room. Or that I met you." Ethan took a deep breath. "We don't have much time. Once this starts, he'll know. He'll fight back. You need to be ready." Lena clenched her fists. "I am." He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since they met. "You're braver than most people I've met. I'm just tired of being afraid." He nodded.
Keep the act going. Be the perfect wife.
"We'll meet here again in 2 nights. I'll bring a burner phone, a plan, and protection." She nodded. Then Ethan did something she didn't expect. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small necklace, plain silver, with a single glass bead. "This belonged to one of the missing women, Chloe Bennett. Her sister gave it to me."
She wanted to me ohne to remember here.
Lena took it gently, her fingers brushing over the cold metal. "I won't forget her," she said softly.
A sound cracked trug the woods.
Both of them froze. Footsteps. Closer now.
Te ducket behind the hedges, crouched low, listening.
A flashlight beam swept across the chapel windows.
Ten sie längse.
A moment later, the sound of retreating steps. Lena exhaled slowly. That was too close. Ethan nodded. "He's watching more than just the house. Be careful." They parted quickly, Ethan disappearing into the forest, Lena retracing her steps back to the estate, wiping mud from her feet before entering through the laundry door. Back in her room, she hid the necklace under her pillow and lay back, heart pounding. She had allies now. But she also had a deadline. She didn't know how much longer she could pretend. Because now, when she looked at Richard Blackwell, she no longer saw a cold, distant husband. She saw a predator. And she was the next name he hadn't yet boxed away. Lena woke to sunlight streaming through the narrow gap in her curtains. It was almost peaceful, until she remembered the weight of the necklace beneath her pillow, the files now missing from Richard's private study, and the meeting last night behind the chapel. She rose slowly, every movement deliberate, rehearsed. Today, more than ever, she had to play the part. No fear.
No hesitation.
No sign that anything had changed. She had to be perfect. Downstairs, the house smelled of fresh coffee and toast. Richard was already seated at the breakfast table, reading the Havenbrook Journal with a half-smile on his face. "Morning, Lena," he said without looking up. "Morning," she replied evenly, pouring herself a cup of coffee with hands that didn't tremble barely. I've been thinking, Richard said, folding the paper neatly. We should take a trip. Maybe Charleston. Or Savannah.
Some wäre wes Charm entkwiet.
Her stomach tightened. When? She asked, trying to sound curious instead of terrified. Soon. A week, maybe less. I'll handle the arrangements. He reached for a slice of toast. It'll be good for us. She forced a smile. That sounds lovely. But inside, alarm bells were screaming. He was changing the game. Moving them away from the estate could only mean one thing: he suspected her. Or worse, he was preparing to act before she did. After breakfast, Lena excused herself to the garden. Richard didn't protest. He seemed in no rush to watch her closely, yet. Which only meant he was watching in ways she couldn't see.
She walked along the gravel paths, past the fountain, trug the overgrown hedges where only birds dare to land.
She moved with calm steps, but her mind raced. She had less than 48 hours until she was supposed to meet Ethan again. She needed to survive until then.
That night, she revisited the forbidden study.
She didn't take anything new. She simply checked. Were the boxes still there?
The cabinet locked?
Nothing moved? To her relief, everything was as she had left it. Or so it seemed. She closed the door, stepped back into the hallway, and froze. Richard was standing at the end of the corridor. He didn't speak. Just stared at her. Lena's heart leapt into her throat. I couldn't sleep, she said quickly. I was walking. In the West Wing? He asked, his tone calm but laced with something colder. It's quiet here. He walked toward her slowly, hands in his pockets. You've adjusted well, he said.
Better than most.
She didn't respond. I often wonder, he continued, how much people are willing to pretend in order to survive. He stopped just inches from her, gaze sharp.
Are you pretending, Lena?
She met his eyes, steadying her breath.
No.
I'm adapting. He smiled. Good answer. He turned and walked away, footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Lena returned to her room and collapsed onto the bed, heart pounding like a war drum. That wasn't just suspicion. It was a warning. The next day passed like molasses, slow, thick, stifling. She tried to act normal. She read in the garden. She asked Martha for a new sketchbook. She even complimented Richard's dinner choice that evening. But underneath it all, she felt the tension tighten like a wire around her neck. And then, just as she was preparing for bed, a knock. Not at her bedroom door. At the window. She froze. Slowly, she moved toward the curtains and peeked out. Ethan. He was crouched just beyond the hedges, face pale in the moonlight. She unlatched the window and slid it open. You're early, she whispered. I had to be, he said, climbing inside.
So meeting's wrong.
She shut the window behind him and drew the curtains. What happened? She asked, breath catching. The FBI agent I mentioned, her name's Agent Keller. She was supposed to meet me this morning in Atlanta. He paused. She never showed. Lena stared at him. What?
I waited for hers.
Called her office.
No response.
Now her voicemail's been wiped clean. I checked with someone I trust. She's been suspended pending internal investigation. No explanation.
Lena sat down on the edge of the bed.
He's one step ahead, she whispered. Again. Ethan nodded. We need to move fast. I don't know how much longer you're safe here. He wants to take me out of town, she said.
Some wäre remote.
He said a week, maybe less. Ethan rubbed his face. That's it. That's the window.
What do you mean?
You can't leave with him. We have to make our move before then. If we wait, you'll be isolated. No contact. No way to help you. Lena swallowed hard.
Ten tomorrow.
After dinner. The chapel. I'll bring a car. A burner phone. Everything we need. Lena nodded, adrenaline pulsing in her veins. She had 24 hours. Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. What's this? She asked. A temporary restraining order, signed by a judge who owes me a favor. It won't stop Richard permanently, but it'll slow him down. As long as you're out and you have this, law enforcement has to take it seriously. She took the paper with trembling fingers. Be careful, he said. He knows something's off. He might act faster than we think.
Ethan klimbet back out through the window, vanising into the shadows.
Lena locked it behind him. She stood alone in the dark room, her reflection barely visible in the antique mirror across from the bed. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, she would stop pretending. But tonight, she still had to wear the mask. The next 24 hours passed like a storm building on the horizon, slow, heavy, and silent before the strike. Lena moved through the mansion as if nothing had changed, wearing her mask of calm, all while her mind screamed with urgency. She memorized the path. From her room to the back corridor. From there to the laundry door.
10 steps, right turn.
8 steps. Left at the cellar.
The garden gate.
The chapel. She practiced it in her mind like a ritual. Richard remained, pleasant.
Topleersand.
He commented on her dress at breakfast. Asked her what flowers she liked for the gala. Told her he had arranged a private dinner in Charleston for the following weekend. He was planning something, too. And he believed she didn't suspect a thing. That night, dinner was served as always. Roasted duck. Steamed carrots. Red wine in tall crystal glasses. Lena ate carefully, responded softly. Smiled once, when he made a dry joke about Havenbrook's town council being as corrupt as they are clueless. But every minute felt like it might snap in half. At 8:30 p.m., she excused herself, saying she wanted to sketch in the conservatory before bed. Richard simply nodded.
Don't stay out too long. There's a storm coming.
I'll be careful, she said. She walked slowly through the halls, then down the back staircase. At the laundry door, she paused. Listened.
Silence.
She opened it and stepped into the night. The air was thick with humidity.
Lichtning flickert behind the trees.
The path to the chapel was darker than usual, clouds covering the moon, but her feet knew the way. She didn't run.
Running made no Oase.
Running meant fear. She slipped behind the hedges, followed the edge of the garden, heart beating so loudly she thought it might echo off the stone walls. At last, the chapel came into view. The wooden door was slightly ajar. She slipped inside. And Ethan was waiting. He stood near the altar, flashlight in hand, soaked from the rain that had just begun to fall. You made it, he said, relief flooding his face.
I memorized ever step, Lena Said, breathless.
Ethan pulled a duffel bag from behind a pew. Here, dry clothes, cash, phone, a map.
We go out the back, through the woods.
My car's parked by the old train tracks, about a mile east. No cameras there. Lena nodded, taking the bag. Her fingers shook as she changed into jeans and a hooded sweatshirt behind the altar screen. Once we're out, we go straight to the state line, Ethan continued. I've booked a motel under a fake name. From there, we send everything to the press.
We make no Oase.
Big noise. Lena stepped out, dressed and ready. Let's go, she said. They pushed open the rear chapel door and stepped into the garden. And stopped. Richard stood by the fountain, holding an umbrella in one hand, a flashlight in the other. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry. He looked amused. I was wondering how long you'd last, he said. Ethan instinctively stepped in front of Lena.
Get out of our way.
Richard tilted his head. You broke into my study.
You stole from me.
You lied. That's disappointing, Lena. You murdered them, she said, voice trembling but firm.
Camille.
Chloe. All of them.
Richard's smile faded. You know nothing.
I know enough, she said.
And so will the world. Richard said.
And what do you think happens now?
You run to the police?
The media? Do you think anyone will believe the word of a traumatized young wife over mine? A war hero. A philanthropist.
A grieving husband.
Try us, Ethan growled.
Lightning cracked across the sky.
And suddenly, Richard dropped the umbrella. From behind the hedge, 2 figures stepped forward, men dressed in dark jackets, one holding a baton. Ethan turned to Lena. Run. No, she said.
Not with you.
But Ethan didn't wait. He lunged at the first man, knocking him off balance. The second came forward, swinging.
Lena ran.
Not toward the woods, but toward the chapel. She had to think. Had to act. Inside, she grabbed the duffel bag, fished out the phone Ethan had given her. She dialed. 1 ring. 2.
911 Vatio Emergency. Mein Name ist Lena Blackwell, she gasped.
I'm being held at Blackwell Estate. My husband has killed women, 6 of them. I have evidence. I'm sending it now. She used the preset contact Ethan had programmed, his newsroom editor. The documents, the journal, the files, all scanned and ready to send. She hit send all. Then ran. Out the front of the chapel, into the storm. Behind her, she heard shouting.
Ethan's voice. Ten sie längse.
She didn't look back.
Branches Tore et her arms.
Mud swallowed her shoes.
The rein blueret evading.
But she kept going.
To the train tracks.
To freedom. She reached the old rail clearing, gasping for breath, just as headlights flashed through the trees.
A pickup truck.
Not Ethan's car. For a terrifying moment, she froze. Then the door opened. It was a woman, mid-40s, dark blazer, FBI badge flashing in the lightning.
Lena Carter? The agent Kellet.
Yes.
Lena stumblet forward. You're safe now.
2 other agents moved past her, heading into the woods with radios and weapons drawn. Lena collapsed into the woman's arms. She had made it. 2 days later.
The headline on Evermajor News Network read.
Widowmaker, billionaire Richard Blackwell arrested in connection with series of missing women. Photos of Lena, frail, exhausted, but standing firm, flashed across television screens. Richard had been taken into federal custody. Ethan was recovering in the hospital. And the contents of Blackwell's study had sparked a multi-state investigation.
Lena satt in am Hotelroom unter Protektion, wettchen sie rein outside.
She wasn't free yet. But she had done what the others couldn't. She had survived. The world outside her motel window was blurred with rain. Lena sat on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a gray hoodie several sizes too large, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. The television was muted, but the images on screen spoke loudly enough. Helicopters circling Blackwell Estate, officers moving evidence boxes, headlines scrolling across the bottom. Richard Blackwell charged with multiple counts of murder, fraud, and obstruction. It didn't feel real. It should have been a victory. But it felt more like aftermath. The FBI agents had been kind, professional, efficient. They told her she was brave. That she had done the right thing. That she had helped bring down a monster. But none of that changed the fact that she still woke up screaming at night. That she still flinched every time she heard the creak of a floorboard. That when she closed her eyes, she sometimes saw Camille in the hallway mirror, trying to speak, always fading before the words could form. She had survived. But survival came with scars. There was a knock at the door. She tensed, instinctively clutching the mug tighter. "It's me," came Ethan's voice. She rose and opened the door. He stood there in jeans and a black jacket, a few bruises still visible on his cheek. He smiled softly when he saw her. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she echoed. He stepped inside, hands in his pockets. The room felt warmer immediately, though neither of them said much. "I brought you something," he said, pulling a small package from his bag. She opened it slowly. Inside was a leather-bound notebook and a pack of charcoal pencils. "You said you used to sketch," he said. "Thought you might want to again." Lena swallowed hard, emotion rising in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. They sat in silence for a few moments. Then Ethan asked, "How are you holding up?" She looked at him, eyes tired but honest. "I don't know yet." He nodded. "That's fair." "I thought I'd feel free," she said. "But mostly I just feel hollow." "That's part of it. You've been in survival mode so long, your body hasn't figured out that it's allowed to rest now." "I don't even know where to go," she admitted.
I can't go back to Havenbrook.
"That house, it's poisoned in my mind." "You don't have to go back," he said.
You start some wäre new.
You build it from scratch.
Some wäre tats yours.
She looked at the notebook in her lap. "I don't know who I am without that place."
Wie tut sie vier? Wie tut pretending.
You're Lena, Ethan said gently.
You're the girl who outsmarted a killer.
Who saved other women's lives. Who stood up when no one else could. She shook her head. I didn't feel brave. I just didn't want to die. He leaned forward. That's exactly why you are brave. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. They sat in silence a while longer, until the storm outside began to quiet. Later, Lena picked up the notebook and sketched for the first time in months. Her fingers were stiff at first, clumsy, but then the lines came easier. A tree. A road.
A small figure walking alone under a heavy sky.
When she finished, she smiled. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. 2 weeks later, Lena stood in a small town 2 states away, staring at the dusty storefront with a for rent sign taped to the glass. The building was old but charming, brick facade, tall windows, and just enough space for something new. Ethan stepped beside her, holding 2 coffees. You sure about this? He asked. She took the cup from him. Not even a little. He laughed. That's a good start. They had been driving for days, visiting towns she had only ever read about, quiet places where no one knew the name Blackwell. Places where she could begin again. This one felt right. She planned to open a small studio, a place to teach art to children, especially those from broken homes. To offer them the kind of outlet she had once needed but never had.
A space for healing, for creation.
She would call it Second Light. Because sometimes, the first light in your life goes out. And you have to find another. That night, Ethan joined her on the porch of the small house they'd rented just outside town. He sat beside her, feet propped on the railing, watching the fireflies. You ever think about what might have happened if I hadn't shown up that day? He asked quietly. She nodded. Every day.
Do you regret it?
Any of it? Lena was quiet for a moment. Then she shook her head.
No. Because I got out.
And because maybe, just maybe, I helped someone else get out too. Ethan looked at her. I think you did a lot more than that. She turned to him, her voice soft. I think I'm starting to feel like myself again. Or maybe, like someone new.
So ohne stronger.
He smiled.
I like here.
A long silence passed. Then she asked, Are you staying? He didn't hesitate. If you'll have me. She reached out, took his hand. I'd like that, she said. Back inside, she opened her laptop. Emails flooded her inbox, media requests, publishers, non-profits. Everyone wanted her to speak, to write, to be a symbol. But she didn't want to be a symbol. She just wanted to be Lena. Still, one email caught her eye. It was from the sister of one of the women, Chloe Bennett. Because of you, my sister's name is in the light again. Thank you for making her more than a headline. Thank you for surviving. Lena placed a hand over her heart. Maybe, she thought, healing didn't come all at once. Maybe it came in moments like this. One name remembered. One drawing sketched. One hand held. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The sun rose slow and golden over the small town of Maple Hollow, casting long beams of light across the sidewalk in front of the old brick storefront.
A new sign hung up over the door now. Second Light, Art und Healing Studio.
Lena stood at the threshold, keys in hand, heart full. She took a breath and stepped inside. The space smelled like fresh paint and cedarwood. The walls were lined with shelves of sketchbooks, paints, pencils, brushes, all donated by volunteers from across the state. In one corner, easels waited by tall windows that flooded the room with natural light. In another, a cozy seating area with beanbags and soft chairs, where kids could talk or sit quietly without pressure. It wasn't just a studio. It was a sanctuary. And it was hers. Opening day wasn't grand. There were no speeches, no ribbon-cutting ceremony. Just a small group of people, neighbors, volunteers, a few curious children, and Ethan, standing quietly in the back with his camera, capturing every smile, every spark of new beginnings. Lena welcomed each person with a soft smile and a kind word. Some knew her story. Most didn't. And that was okay. She wasn't here to be famous. She was here to be useful. By mid-afternoon, a girl no older than 10 sat in front of an easel, tongue between her teeth as she carefully shaded a tree. Her mother watched from the couch, eyes watery. When Lena passed by, the woman touched her arm gently. She hasn't spoken since the custody case, she whispered. But this is the first time I've seen her focus on something for more than 5 minutes. Lena's throat tightened.
She's safe here. That's all that matters.
By sunset, the room was quiet again. Lena stood alone at the center, turning slowly, taking in everything they had built. It wasn't just a new life. It was a reclaimed one. Later that week, Lena was invited to speak at a conference on trauma and recovery. At first, she declined. She didn't see herself as a speaker or a role model. She was still healing, still figuring out who she was outside of the nightmare she had survived. But Ethan encouraged her. Tell your story, he said.
Not for you.
For the ones still inside their own cages. So she did. On stage, under soft lights and in front of hundreds of silent listeners, Lena stood tall. Her voice shook at first. But as she spoke, the fear melted away. She told them about Havenbrook. About the girl who wore silence like armor. About the house with too many doors and not enough escape routes. About the man who smiled like a savior and devoured like a monster. She told them how she had survived not because she was fearless, but because she refused to be forgotten. She ended with this. I was once the girl who couldn't speak above a whisper. I was once the girl who made herself small to survive. But silence didn't save me. Speaking did. Remember this, the darkness doesn't end with escape. It ends when we bring a light back for others. The room stood in applause.
Not for drama.
But for truth. In the months that followed, Lena's story reached far beyond the walls of the courthouse or the headlines. Survivors wrote to her. Families thanked her. Artists sent pieces inspired by her strength. She answered as many letters as she could. Each one a reminder, she wasn't alone. She never had been. One day, a young woman arrived at Second Light with a duffel bag and tear-streaked cheeks. She didn't say a word. Just handed Lena a folded photograph. It was of Camille Harper. Lena recognized the smile instantly. I knew her, the woman whispered. She was my sister. Lena took her hand. She still is. They stood in silence, holding grief and memory between them like something sacred. That night, Lena painted for the first time in months. She painted a woman walking through a forest of shadows, carrying a lantern.
The light wasn't bricht.
But it was steady. On a quiet evening, Lena and Ethan sat on the porch of their small home outside town, watching the stars blink into the sky.
A warm breze stiert wind chimes.
He reached over and took her hand. You ever think about what's next? He asked. She smiled faintly.
Not like you said too.
How do you mean? I used to think life was a line, she said.
You start, you move forward, you reach so meeting.
And now I think it's more like a spiral.
You revisit things.
Sometimes pain.
Sometimes joy.
But each time, you're a little stronger.
A little more you.
Ethan squeezed her hand.
That's beautiful. No, Lena said softly.
That's healing. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of cicadas rising around them. Then Ethan said, I'm proud of you. She looked at him. I'm proud of us. Because Lena's story had never been hers alone. It had been Camille's. Chloe's.
Ever woman who never made it out.
And every girl who still might. The next morning, Lena opened Second Light and found a small envelope taped to the door. Inside was a drawing, a child sketch of a girl holding a flashlight in a dark forest, surrounded by stars.
On the back, a note in crayon. Thank you for marking the dark not so scare anymore.
Lena held it to her chest, tears stinging her eyes. Because that was it. That was the story.
Not the pain. Not the survival.
But the light she chose to carry forward.
And the lives it tuchet along the way.